Rogue waves, exploding mines, a global shutdown. Not even the threat of destruction from Adolf Hitler himself could stop the RMS Queen Mary. She lives on, defying all odds, and in this video, we deep dive into every instance where the ship should have faced demise. The first time the Queen Mary had faced certain doom was during her construction in the early 1930s. The Great Depression had almost canceled her completely. The story of the Royal Mail ship Queen Mary perhaps begins with the famous Cunard liner RMS Mauretania. Mauretania had held the coveted unofficial title of the Blue Riband for the fastest North Atlantic crossing for 19 years, succeeded by Germany's SS Bremen in 1929. This was a great blow to British pride. The people of the nation enjoyed their supremacy of the sea. These great passenger liners were more than just ships. They were symbols of their country. Since about 1926, the Cunard Steamship Company had been making plans to build two superliners that would exceed 1,000 feet in length and operate on the North Atlantic run to replace the three smaller ships Mauretania, Aquitania, and Berengaria. Losing the Blue Riband to the Germans had put pressure on Cunard to construct a new champion. Engineers of John Brown Shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland had finished most of the designs, and they constructed several 17-foot-long models of the ship that they would test in the water tank to simulate all manner of ocean conditions. Over 8,000 tests were performed until Cunard was finally satisfied with the plans, signing a $30 million contract with John Brown Shipyards on December 1, 1930, to construct what they called Job Number 534. 10 days later, workers began to lay down the keel. For over a year, construction continued as planned. As the steel girders and ribs of the hull were built ever upward, the economy continued to shrink under the weight of the Great Depression. Despite this, the workers at Clydebank were still ahead of schedule and aiming for a launch date of May 1932. However, Cunard was suffering from low ticket sales, and any profits that were made were quickly being absorbed by the costs of the new liner. On December 10, 1931, Cunard halted construction on the ship due to a lack of funds. Hull number 534 was one of the last Clydebank jobs that had continued during the Depression, and now that they had lost it, all work had ceased. The sudden silence that overcame the industrial town was stark and eerie. Sir Percy Bates, chairman of the Cunard Line, was receiving letters every day from citizens around Great Britain asking that he continue work on Hull 534 and keep people working. Some letters even contained small contributions of money in hopes that any amount would help save the liner. Sir Percy Bates assured the public he would see the ship completed. Prior to the halt on construction, the chairman of White Star Line, Walter Runciman, had pleaded with Cunard to merge with them so that both companies might survive the economic downturn. But White Star had an aging fleet of ships, and Cunard was reluctant to dilute their assets in a merger. As it turned out, Walter Runciman would later join Britain's Board of Trade, and when Cunard went to Parliament to request a government subsidy to finance the completion of 534, it was Mr. Runciman that influenced Parliament to agree on a loan under the condition that Cunard merges with White Star Line to consolidate their debts. Cunard had been put through a tough situation because Sir Percy Bates had the much-needed support from the Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne, and he didn't want to disregard it. On December 14, 1933, the merger was announced, and henceforth the company would be known as Cunard White Star. British Parliament would loan the company £9.5 million to complete the first ship and start the second one. Clydebank was abuzz with the roar of cheers and celebration on the morning of April 3, 1934, as 400 men marched down to the shipyard escorted by bagpipers. The men had to clear the hull of thousands of nesting birds and proceeded to scrape off nearly 130 tons of rust that had accumulated over the last 2 years. Soon the ship was in full swing with 3,800 workers busy on construction. They were even visited by the Prince of Wales as the riveters hammered in the 10 million rivets that would hold the ship together. Getting the people back to work had become a symbol of optimism across the United Kingdom. The next time the Queen Mary's survival would be called into question was during the Second World War, several times during the war, in fact. With Great Britain declaring war on Germany, that put Britain's ocean liners at risk of being sunk or captured. During the First World War, ocean liners were used as hospital ships, supply ships, and probably most importantly, troop ships. To sink the enemy's passenger liners would mean full hindering of their ability to ship troops and goods to battle. From day one of Britain's involvement in the war, RMS Queen Mary was a floating target for enemy bombers and submarines. The ship had arrived in New York to deliver her passengers on schedule, but instead of loading up for a return trip to Southampton, Cunard White Star had ordered the Mary to stay at Pier 90 for the time being. Cunard knew that their flagship could not be attacked as long as she was floating in the neutral waters of the United States of America. In the beginning years of the war, the newly designated HMT Queen Mary, standing for His Majesty's troopship, was tasked with shuttling troops from Australia to Scotland, and also to the battle happening at the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to their extended empire in India. Throughout the war, the ship's biggest defense against the enemy was her speed. Combine that with the zigzag course she took and her gray-painted hull, it made her well camouflaged, and she could sail in and out of enemy range so quickly that they would never have a chance to hit her with torpedoes. As a result, Queen Mary was one of the many ships in history to be referred to as the Grey Ghost. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States entered the war. Between 10,000 and 15,000 men would be stuffed into the ship on a single voyage. On February 18, 1942, the Queen Mary set sail from Boston with 14,000 American troops on board on her way to Sydney, with a scheduled stop for fuel in Trinidad. The voyage would last 40 days, and soon after she set sail, word had reached the ship that a German U-boat had entered the harbor at Trinidad and sunk 2 ships. The Queen Mary was immediately rerouted to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Greatly alarmed by the transport capacity of the Cunard Queens, Adolf Hitler himself put out a bounty on the 2 ships. Any submarine captain who could sink either of the Queens would be rewarded with the equivalent of 1 million Reichsmarks and the Iron Cross with oak leaves. In a desperate effort to win their country's honor, enemy submarines around the world hunted down the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, but all efforts would fail. On October 2, 1942, the Queen Mary was rounding the seas just off the coast of Northern Ireland on her way to her destination in Scotland. The Queen Mary was on her zigzag course, designed to make it difficult for enemy ships to calculate her next move. Her escort into Scotland was the HMS Curaçao, which came alongside her, heading 25 knots. As the Mary turned, that put her on a collision course with her escort. In moments before either ship could steer away, the sharp bow of the Queen Mary sliced through the middle of the cruiser. The passengers aboard the Mary had barely felt a shudder. The men aboard the ill-fated cruiser had little time to react. They either leapt into the cold water or held on to the mangled vessel as it swiftly dropped into the sea. Some of the men that survived being taken down with the ship were pulled towards the speeding hull of Queen Mary and sucked into her propellers. As the ship steamed away, the American troops on the Mary had tossed overboard whatever buoyant objects they could, many of them getting a hold of their own life jackets and throwing them into the messy wreckage. The Queen Mary was under orders not to stop for anything or anyone. 338 men from HMS Curaçao had died in the accident. Queen Mary dropped off her troops and limped to Boston Harbor in the United States with a crumpled bow, but there was no casualties or extensive damage to the ocean liner. In December of 1942, the Queen Mary was carrying roughly 16,000 American troops on a journey across the North Atlantic towards Scotland. She ran into a rather nasty storm. She encountered swells up to 65 feet and gale-force winds. She was suddenly struck on the starboard side by a 92-foot rogue wave. it knocked loose the lifeboats, smashed windows on the bridge, and punched open various portholes throughout the ship, throwing men about and washing them into the corridors. The force had caused the ship to roll 52 degrees off vertical. Only 3 more degrees of tilt and she would have certainly capsized, killing most, if not everyone aboard. In terms of strength, the Queen Mary is considered to be one of the best engineered ocean liners ever built, and her design proved resilient against the worst that nature could throw at her. But even the best engineered passenger ship could be at risk from weapons of war. On one of her voyages to Scotland, the ship was carrying 15,000 troops when the Mary narrowly avoided a massive explosion just 300 feet from the hull. To this day, no one knows for sure what the cause of the explosion was, but it is widely believed that the ship triggered a mine. There were no damages to the ocean liner, however, things could have been much worse if she were passing over it. After 6 years of being hunted down by enemy submarines, traveling 569,943 nautical miles on more than 75 voyages, and transporting 810,730 troops to war, the Queen Mary had survived the largest war in world history, and was credited with helping to shorten the war by a year. After the war, Queen Mary sailed only 8 Christmas voyages. Perhaps they were a rarity, but that's what made them special. The ship's public spaces were decorated with trees, garland, ribbon, and plenty of tinsel. Children could send their letters to Father Christmas using the ship's various post boxes. Members of the purser's department would form a caroling group and go from cabin to cabin singing songs to the passengers. Unfortunately, Christmas on Queen Mary wasn't always a happy occasion for every passenger. On Christmas Day in 1965, during one of Queen Mary's cruises to the Canary Islands, the ship ran into a rather nasty storm off the Bay of Biscay. A father and his son were walking along the forward promenade deck, admiring the frightening seas, when a rogue wave suddenly struck the Mary on her starboard side, lifting a 2-ton cowl vent and sending it crashing through the 3/4-inch plate glass armored windows. The man and his boy had to be treated for more than 100 minor cuts, but were ultimately all right. The ship itself once again survived a catastrophe, but her next challenge would be one of the greatest brushes with doom she had faced since the Great Depression. By the year 1967, the Queen Mary was no longer needed for transatlantic service. Airplanes had become the dominant means of crossing the oceans. When Cunard had announced that they were retiring both queens, people around the world protested with their voices and written letters. Most uncommonly for the mid-20th century, wealthy people, corporations, and cities placed bids to acquire the Queen Mary. This was a time when normally the only companies to bid for a retired ship were scrapyards. The Queen Mary was won at auction by the most unlikely of bidders. The California seaside community of Long Beach had put up the largest sum and intended to preserve her as a hotel and museum. The Mary would need to sail to Long Beach under her own power on the last and longest voyage she had ever undertaken. Since she was too big to fit through the Panama Canal, she spent 39 days at sea, sailing around the tumultuous Cape Horn, a sea that was often avoided even to this day for its proclivity for sinking all manner of ships. Oddly enough, though poor weather conditions and rough seas were predicted, the weather seemed to clear right at the most crucial stretch of water around the Cape, and the Mary sailed on to Long Beach without issue. Incredibly, after surviving a depression, a world war, rogue waves, underwater mines, scrap yards, and a dangerous stretch of ocean known for sinking ships, the Mary would still face brushes with doom even in her retirement. The ship had been a hotel and museum for 16 years when in 1988, the Walt Disney Company had inherited the lease to the ship when they bought out the Rather Corporation. While Disney had invested large sums in repairing and maintaining the ship, their real focus was on the adjacent land that was part of the lease. They wanted to build a theme park on it, but move the Queen Mary a 1/4 mile towards the mouth of Los Angeles River so that the aging ship wouldn't loom over their new development. To ensure the ship's preservation from under Disney's tendency to throw out the old and replace with the new, Long Beach insisted the company follow a strict checklist of repairs and upgrades to the Queen Mary. Not only that, but if they wanted to be approved to build their theme park, they would have to pay to upgrade the roads and utilities near the theme park area, something Disney was used to doing around their theme park in Anaheim, but was unwilling to do in Long Beach. In 1992, Disney gave up and decided not to renew their lease. The ship was closed to the public, and the dream of repairing and maintaining the Queen Mary as a premier tourist attraction had foundered. For months, there were rumors of the ship being scrapped or towed out to sea and sunk because it was falling into neglect and operating the ship was difficult to do at a profit. The community of Queen Mary fans and preservationists band together to convince Long Beach to save the ship, and so the city signed a lease agreement for the RMS Foundation to be the new operator of the ship. Once again, the ship dodged its demise. Nearly 3 decades later, and a long string of operators changing hands, failing to make the ship profitable and selling off their failure to the next company, things came to a final head when in spring of 2020, the world went on lockdown. The Queen Mary shut its doors and hatches seemingly for the very last time. After 30 years of terrible neglect and a complete lack of interest from any company willing to buy the lease to the ship and inherit the years of compounding failures, the rumors of the ship's demise were louder and more prominent than ever. The ship became the subject of doom and gloom to the newspapers and media. They printed and posted stories of the impossibility of making the ship profitable or worthwhile to operate. But there were people out there who held the facts in their hands that the ship could be profitable, if only the right people stepped up to take over. When it came to media, my YouTube channel was among the first, if not the first, media content that shined a glimmer of hope on the ship. In April of 2021, this channel posted a video called "Let's Save the Queen Mary." It highlighted the historical significance of the ship and ways it could generate a profit. The video garnered 100,000 views, which was enough to get people from all over the world to email me. And over the course of several months, we created a small network of people who voiced our desire to save the ship. It may or may not have caused the city of Long Beach to decide to save the ship, but what it did do was make the Queen Mary a mainstream subject again and get people talking about her again. And most importantly, it instilled hope in the ship's future. Suddenly, all kinds of YouTube videos were being created sharing the stories of the ship and the history locked inside. The city of Long Beach hired the Elliot Bay Design Group, a marine engineering firm, to spend 6 months surveying and testing the ship's structure and materials. They even had divers survey the hull with ultrasound to get an understanding of the ship's condition. After all the work, the marine engineering firm came up with a few choices for the city to decide on. They could either sell the ship for scrap, which in actuality would cost the city more money than it would make selling it, or the city could sink it as a reef, which at a cost of $100 million would be cheaper than scrapping it. Or at the cost of nearly $300 million, they could restore the ship. Elliot Bay Design Group had suggested that restoring the ship was the best option. At first thought, it might seem like the cheapest option would be to sink the ship. Why pay 3 times more to restore it? Well, the thing is, to pay to scrap the ship or sink it would cost the city $100 million that they would never see again. However, if the ship were to reopen, then despite the enormous cost, the ship would have the potential to make the money back. This is where the company Evolution Hospitality comes in. Previous operators of the ship didn't actually take care of the day-to-day operations of the ship. Instead, those operators hired Evolution Hospitality to do it. The ship's leaseholding company would then take in the profits that were made. When the city took back operational control of the ship in 2021, they cut out the middleman by not getting a leaseholder for the ship, and instead hired Evolution Hospitality to run the operation of the ship on behalf of the city of Long Beach. Evolution does not own or lease the ship. They are merely the custodians that are contracted by the city to run it. Not only that, but Evolution had put their best management teams to the task of revitalizing the aging ship. Meanwhile, the city of Long Beach invested $25 million in critical repairs, finding more economical ways of completing repairs and getting the jobs done under budget. And the best part is, ever since the ship arrived in Long Beach in 1967, none of the money spent on Queen Mary came from taxpayer dollars. And all the positive media that had been growing for 3 years online had led to a successful reopening of the ship when it opened its doors in April of 2023. And from that month, all the way to the end of the year, Evolution Hospitality reported that they had been turning a profit. It was the first time in nearly 3 decades that the Queen Mary had been in the black. This proved the point that proper planning and lucrative business decisions could make the ship successful. Today, the Queen Mary continues to turn a profit, and the money it generates gets reinvested back into the ship's repairs and cosmetic refurbishments. Thanks to the upgrades to fire safety systems, emergency power generators, new automatic bilge pumps, and water intrusion alarms, the now 90-year-old ocean liner is safer to be on than ever before. Huge plans for more new attractions and exhibits are on the way, and the future for this fantastic ship is looking brighter than ever. Through the 9 decades that this ship has existed, it has always faced the threat of its demise, be it the Great Depression that nearly prevented the hull from slipping into the water for the first time, to a world war that had Hitler himself threatening to destroy the ship, to massive rogue waves that tried to overturn the Queen from her throne, and even to various operational and financial crises that threatened to bring the retired ship to the breaker's hammer. The Queen Mary endured and plowed forward. Captain John Treasure Jones, the final skipper and master to command the Queen Mary, said that the ship lived, breathed, and had character. He said the ship was the only vessel he commanded to have as close to a heart and soul as any living human being. And now I see why. She has a fighting spirit, one that refuses to die. Defying all odds, the Queen Mary perseveres, emerging from every brush with doom stronger than before. After hearing all of this, do you think this ship possesses a character of its own? Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more content like it, including the history of people and places from the Steam Age, then subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.